One of the most frustrating parts of the information overload.
This is the fourth time I'm trying to do this. Hopefully this works. Hit that like and subscribe for me. I'm still learning this shit. I really appreciate the help. Let's see if Tucker calls anybody bitch today.
That we live in now, where things are constantly coming at us through our phones, is that we never get a resolution to some of the biggest stories of our time. Something will just explode. It'll happen. Well, that's amazing. I can't believe that. And you'll have about 4 hours to think about what happened and its implications. Then you're on to the next thing. It's just the nature of having too much information. Now, whether that's by design, whether we're being overloaded as part of some diabolical plan to keep us distracted, or whether that's a natural byproduct of technology, unrestrained technology, it's not clear, and it probably doesn't matter because that's the daily lived experience of most Americans. Something huge will happen. You'll form an impression of it. Not clear whether that's a correct impression or not, and then we'll move on. And this is true even of really big events. The biggest mass shooting in American history took place a little less than 9 years ago, 2017, in Las Vegas. And some guy apparently opened fire on a concert right below him. You remember this? 867 people were injured. 60 were killed by gunfire, at least. And there was an FBI investigation, and the authorities stared into the camera and said, we're going to get to the bottom of this. And the normal parasites showed up.
I think I'm lying.
Telling us that, the lesson is we have too many guns in this country. Guns are the problem. You shouldn't have a gun because a lunatic shot people in Las Vegas or whatever. They took advantage of the tragedy to push their own agendas. And then that's kind of the last we heard of it. Who was this guy? Some guy. Stephen Paddock, some guy. What was his motive? Unclear. Didn't leave a manifesto, so we don't really know. There seems to be some evidence that the official story is false. Yeah, it's fine. And then because we were so distracted with all the other things that were taking place at the time, no one ever really followed up in a satisfactory way. And so even now, the largest mass shooting in American history is solved officially. But do we have a satisfactory answer that explains why it happened? No, we don't. We're not even close to that. In fact, the answer that we do have may be completely different from the actual answer. We don't know. And no one is actively trying to find out. Because again, we're on to the next thing. And so on and so on and so on with almost every big news story over the past, 15 years more. And there's kind of no way to change this because there's not enough time in life to go back and reverse engineer what we thought we knew about the most significant moments in American history. But there are a few of them that are worth pressing on, even though years have passed. And one of the top ones after 9/11, which is the most important story of our lives because it completely changed America, the structure of America. But after that, you'd have to say that January 6th is near the top of the list. Why? Well, a bunch of reasons. Most obviously because January 6th produced the single largest federal criminal investigation in American history. Almost every single FBI field office was involved in tracking down the perpetrators of this insurrection, in which many policemen were murdered, and so on and so forth. Well, almost every one of those details turned out to be a lie. It was not actually an insurrection. No one was armed. No one had a gun. There's no such thing as an unarmed insurrection. Can't insurrect if you're unarmed. And no police officers were murdered that day. In fact, the only person shot to death that day was a protester who was shot to death by a cop, a Capitol policeman called Michael Byrd.
This whole time I thought a lady died and a cop died.
Her name was Ashley Babbitt. You're familiar with the rough outline of this. But the one fact that is true is that this did produce the largest FBI investigation in American history. 5,000 agents were involved. And in the end, they arrested about 1,500 people on federal crimes. And a bunch of those people went to jail. Now, not everybody who was involved that day on camera, provably involved, including people who encouraged others to breach the Capitol, to go inside to break an obvious law by going into a locked federal building. Not all of those people wound up being charged or serving jail time. Nick Fuentes, for example, was on camera encouraging people to storm the Capitol. He wasn't punished for that.
I'm over at a megaphone.
Certainly didn't serve any jail time over it. Ray Epps didn't serve any jail time over it. Same thing. What is that? Maybe just a weird anomaly. where the feds spent years in the, again, largest domestic criminal investigation in American history, charged 1,500 people with federal crimes, but just missed a couple who were on camera encouraging others to break the law. You know, things happen. Bureaucracies are famously inefficient. Maybe they just kind of forgot those guys. Or maybe something else was going on. We're still arguing about that. But lost in all of this debate, and you'll remember there wasn't much debate about January 6th at first. Everybody was appalled by it. It was an insurrection. Republicans were appalled by it. When Ashley Byrd was killed, there were Republican senators who applauded the shooting of an unarmed woman, an Air Force veteran, by a cop with a record of reckless behavior, Michael Byrd. They were just happy she was dead because she was threatening them somehow. She was like 5'2", an unarmed woman, and she was shot to death for no justifiable reason, but they were happy. Republicans were happy. And why were they happy? Well, because a lot of them are basically authoritarian, of course, but because they felt threatened. They're such physical cowards that Ashley Babbitt, her presence, threatened them, apparently. So almost nobody really asked these questions at first, and the few who did were strongly discouraged from asking those questions. They were defending violence or vandalism or whatever, insurrection. But over time, it became clear that the purpose of the exercise was to discredit Donald Trump, who had just lost the election. Remember, this all took place on the day the vote was being certified. Accuse him of trying to overturn the results of that election, get him impeached and convicted, and thereby prevent him from ever running for office again. The purpose of the whole exercise, at least the aftermath, the propaganda, the lies that attached to the events subsequently, the purpose of that was to solve the Trump problem once and for all. Like, he's gone. He will never darken our city with a shadow again. We're not going to have to deal with that. All the uncomfortable questions about our foreign policy or our economic policy, like, no more Trump. And both parties could get behind that. In fact, they strongly were both behind that. This is before they subverted Trump and somehow brought him to their side. Who knows how that happened? We've addressed that in other episodes. But the point is, we now know with some clarity and certainty that January 6th was not, in fact, an insurrection against the Congress.
I feel like Trump is going after this election. We're not going to be hearing about him too much, I feel like, at least. And J.D. Vance is going to be coming up, and Tucker likes him, and I don't like that motherfucker at all. I don't know him. Literally. The motherfucker changed his name like 3 times. I don't know fuck all about this dude. I know he's funded by Peter Thiel, though, so that's fun.
It was an insurrection by the Congress, by permanent Washington, against the population. And that's really, really clear. But there was one part of that story that was really never resolved at all, one way or the other. And it was a widely reported facet, and then soon forgotten part of the story, in which somebody planted pipe bombs, like Unabomber type pipe bombs, pipes with explosives, outside the Republican National Committee and the Democratic National Committee the morning of 9/11. And this is one of those stories, again, that right away in the first hours after the fake insurrection happened, news outlets told you about it, and then they kind of stopped reporting on it. And then we learned maybe a year later that Kamala Harris was at the DNC when the pipe bomb was found, but somehow she'd never mentioned it. And you begin to think, it's not clear what happened there, but probably not what they told us. And by the way, why haven't they answered the question, who did this? This is Capitol Hill. This is Washington, D.C. This is one of the most surveilled places on planet Earth. There are very few physical spots on Capitol Hill where you're not being monitored by cameras, where there's no CCTV recording your movements. And of course, now with advances in technology, facial recognition, but others, it should be pretty easy to find out who planted bombs on Capitol Hill, especially if you've got the largest domestic law enforcement investigation in American history trying to find out. But instead, there was basically silence until a guy called Darren Beattie, who ran at the time a website called Revolver News, ran a piece that asked that question, like, wait, why haven't they solved this? And what was that? And how would that be connected to the events of January 6th? If this was in fact an insurrection by Trump voters against the system itself, against the United States of America. This is like a modern Fort Sumter preceding a civil war. And that's literally what they told us it was. They tried to overthrow the government.
Later.
Okay, now, how did that fit in? What did that have to do with it? And the explanation that the Biden administration gave, sort of, to the extent they talked about it, was, well, this was an effort to distract people, law enforcement, from the insurrection that was happening at the Capitol. They would set off these bombs outside the two-party headquarters. Law enforcement would rush there, and the insurrectionists would continue to, I don't know what, sit at Nancy Pelosi's desk, wander aimlessly around the Senate, which is what actually happened. It didn't actually do anything, but whatever, except get shot. But that's kind of where they left it. But this piece by Darren Beattie raised the possibility that, of course, and once you thought about this, was clearly true, of course, federal law enforcement know exactly who planted bombs in front of the party headquarters. What made January 6th different from all other widely publicized crimes in our lifetimes is that it was a crime committed not against private citizens. It wasn't like shooting people at a country music concert in Las Vegas, injuring 867 of them. I mean, that's sad, of course, but what does that have to do with Washington? What does that have to do with us? What does that have to do with people who run the country? No, those are like, whatever, country music fans probably voted for Trump. Like, it's sad. Maybe we can use their deaths to advocate for disarming the population, but it's not really a threat to anyone's power. Just the opposite, actually. January 6th was at least construed, and I think a lot of the people who repeated the propaganda convinced themselves that this was an actual threat to bipartisan Washington, not just to Democrats, but to Republicans. Lindsey Graham was every bit as upset as Chuck Schumer because it was a threat to the symbol of their power, the Congress, which once upon a time was called the People's House, and it was called the People's House as a reminder that actually the purpose of all of this is to serve the owners of the country, which is not members of Congress, 535 stewards of the country. It's the people who vote for them, the citizens. They own all of this. So they own, by definition, the Congress itself, the People's House. That's not the prevailing attitude in Washington, which, needless to say, is we own all of this, and you're here for some purpose, increasingly unclear. Labor has no value thanks to AI, so it's not like you're actually doing anything for us. You're kind of in the way. And the last thing we want is for you to like pipe up and criticize us or get in the way of whatever our plans might be. You're just kind of annoying hecklers, spoiling the play that we're putting on for our own amusement. And so shut up. And by the way, if you refuse to shut up and if you get really mouthy about it and show up with bullhorns at our house, not yours, not the people's, our house, we're going to put you in prison. And we're going to deny you bail. And for the overwhelming majority of you who can't afford competent counsel, we're going to give you public defenders who hate you, who ensure that you're going to be stuck in some roach-infested hellhole, for example, DC City Jail. So that's what happened. But the pipe bomb question hung in the air. How could they not know who did that? They're highly motivated to track down the perpetrators, but somehow not that interested in solving a crime, a attempted bombing of the two political headquarters. Didn't make any sense at all, as Darren Beattie bravely and correctly pointed out several years ago. But still, the Washington Post, the New York Times didn't seem to have a lot of interest in solving this crime or in pushing federal law enforcement to solve the crime. Like, what's the status of this? How many hours of CCTV footage do you have? Have you looked at it? Have you run it against your facial recognition software? Why can't you find the person who did this? You know you can. Why aren't you? And so it really took, 4 or 5 years until a reporter called Steve Baker, who at the time worked for The Blaze, really set about trying to answer this question. And as you're about to hear in our interview with Steve Baker, he went to some lengths to solve the riddle. And he may or may not have solved it. I mean, we're not weighing in on that. And his conclusions are now the subject of a pretty well publicized lawsuit. So not only is it not our place to weigh in on it, just want to make it clear, we're not weighing in on it. But it certainly is an inspiration to the rest of us that we should probably get to the bottom of this. So Steve Baker spends quite a long time trying to figure this out, and he thinks he figures it out, and he names somebody, wrongly or not. And within literally days, after years of not solving this crime, federal authorities arrest a guy who they claim did it. And he is, by all descriptions, some apparently autistic guy, black guy. And they spun this whole story, and he confessed to the crime, and like, we can rest easy now. He did it because who knows what, he's transgender or something. Who knows? I can't even remember what the excuse was for why this guy did it. And a lot of people who know the guy pretty well are like, yeah, no, he didn't do that. Like, that's absurd. But, we're not going to weigh in on that because we don't know. What we do know is that after years of apparently not doing anything to solve this crime, which is prima facie a serious crime, bombing the party headquarters on Capitol Hill, yeah, that's serious. The Department of Justice just solved it in about 10 minutes after Steve Baker throws out another hypothesis as to who did it, a federal employee. That's his theory. So we're not quite sure what to make of this other than a reminder that no U.S. citizen has an obligation to take the word of anyone in an official capacity, in authority, and particularly not in federal law enforcement, as gospel. Just because they say it does not mean it's true, obviously. Just because anybody says anything doesn't mean it's true. People lie. Not always, hopefully not often, but they do sometimes. We know that. And people in authority have motive to lie, particularly when they're covering up something that they did in the first place. And that may be the macro lesson of this. There has been no effort, really, and no pressure to provoke an effort, really, to find out who is behind these supposed pipe bombings, in part because everyone in Washington is potentially implicated in this.
That's crazy.
If it turned out that January 6th was not an entirely organic, maybe partly organic, but not an entirely organic event, if it turned out that it was to some extent, maybe not wholly, but in part staged or encouraged by people with a completely different agenda, an agenda that included sabotaging Trump's political career going forward, then the perpetrators wouldn't just be the Democratic Party, they would be the majority of Republican leadership. It would be a bipartisan effort. And that may be the real takeaway here. What we're looking at on January 6th, what we're looking at in the Iran war, what we're looking at in the total mismanagement of the U.S. economy for most of our lives, is not a partisan question. It's not like one party took control, got both houses of Congress and the White House, packed the Supreme Court, and went crazy. It's that the leaders of both parties, not their voters, but the leaders of both parties in Washington had a very similar vision for what they wanted, how it might benefit them, and they did it. Not in opposition to each other, but in consensus, in agreement with each other. That is the unavoidable conclusion if you look at the past, say, 40 years of American history. Not that the parties are bitterly at odds, but that they are secretly in collusion. How could you reach another conclusion if you look at the outcome? You probably couldn't. But this specific story, while not related to economic or foreign policy, is a kind of window into the wall of resistance that you bump up against when you start asking questions about, hey, what is going on here? America's 250th.
Both parties, man. Fuck us right in the ass and then go behind the curtain, shake hands, and laugh about it like, ha ha. Put up a good fight on stage, didn't we? Now let's go do butt stuff in the back together. Ha! Gays. Both the parties are fucking horrible. Hey, hit that like and subscribe. I will love you forever, and I will be back next time.